The bruise on Beatrice Donovan's face told a story of violence that the small Missouri town of Clifton Hill wasn't prepared to hear as she stepped down from the dusty stagecoach on a sweltering July afternoon in 1872. Her mail-order bride advertisement had promised a woman of gentle disposition and sturdy constitution, but said nothing of the purple shadow that bloomed beneath her right eye or the trembling hands that clutched her worn carpetbag. Daniel Calloway stood rigid among the small crowd gathered at the stage-coach stop, his weathered hat in his hands and his jaw clenched tight as his bride-to-be approached. He wasn't what most would call a traditional cowboy. He owned a modest cattle ranch outside town rather than drifting with the herds, but the calluses on his hands and the sun-leathered skin told of years under the western sky. "Miss Donovan?" he asked, though he knew the answer from her hesitant nod and the daguerreotype he'd carried in his pocket for months. "Mr. Calloway," she confirmed, her voice stronger than her appearance suggested. She attempted a smile that faltered when she noticed his gaze fixed on her injured eye. Daniel took her carpetbag, his movements careful as though approaching a spooked horse. The crowd around them had fallen uncomfortably silent, all eyes on the pair. "Who did this before you left town?" The words escaped his lips before propriety could stop them, rough with an anger not directed at her but at whoever had marked her face. Beatrice's chin lifted slightly, the only outward sign of defiance in her otherwise demure posture. "It's a long story, Mr. Calloway." "Perhaps not for the street," Daniel nodded, understanding her need for privacy, but the protective instinct that had flared inside him didn't diminish. "Of course, my wagon's this way." He gestured toward a modest but well-maintained buckboard at the edge of the square. "We've got a bit of a ride ahead of us." As they walked, Daniel noticed how Beatrice kept a precise distance between them. Her gown, though dusty from travel, was of good quality if somewhat outdated by Eastern standards. She wasn't what he'd expected. She was better educated than her letters had implied. Her accent refined despite her humble background as a seamstress from Boston. "I hope your journey wasn't too difficult," Daniel offered as he helped her onto the wagon seat, careful not to touch her more than necessary. "Nothing I couldn't endure," she replied, arranging her skirts with practiced movements. "Though I admit the last leg from St. Louis was rather grueling." Daniel climbed up beside her and took the reins. "It's about an hour to the ranch. Not a grand place, but solid. Built it myself over the last 5 years." As the wagon pulled away from Clifton Hill, the whispers began behind them. Daniel pretended not to hear, but Beatrice's shoulders stiffened, betraying her awareness of being the newest object of town gossip. "They'll find something else to talk about by Sunday," Daniel assured her. "Small towns run on gossip like engines on coal." Beatrice's hands twisted in her lap. "I suppose I've given them quite the first impression." "Their opinions don't matter much to me," Daniel said, eyes on the road ahead, "and they shouldn't to you either." The countryside opened before them, rolling hills giving way to scattered homesteads, and eventually the open range where cattle grazed under the endless blue sky. Daniel pointed out landmarks as they traveled the creek that ran through his property, the stand of cottonwoods that marked the northern boundary, the distant outline of the modest house that would be her new home. "It's beautiful," Beatrice said softly, and Daniel glanced over to find her gaze not on the landscape but on a wild meadow of prairie flowers bending in the breeze. "Spring brings more color," he told her, "but summer has its own charms." They rode in silence for a while, the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels filling the space between them. Daniel didn't press about her injury, though the question burned in his mind. Instead, He focused on giving her time to acclimate to this new world she'd entered. "I should tell you," Beatrice finally spoke, her voice barely audible above the wagon sounds, "that I understand if you wish to dissolve our arrangement. I wouldn't hold it against you." Daniel's hands tightened on the reins. "Because of your eye, because I'm not." She paused, searching for words. "What you were promised." "I don't recall being promised anything specific," Daniel replied carefully, "except a woman willing to come west and try to build a life here." "Is that still what you want?" Her question hung in the air between them. Daniel considered his response carefully. "I think we should give ourselves time to know each other before making any decisions. The preacher doesn't visit until the first Sunday of next month anyway." Relief visibly washed over Beatrice's features. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Calloway." "Daniel," he corrected. "If we're to live in the same house, even temporarily, you might as well use my given name." "Then you must call me Beatrice," she responded, the ghost of a smile playing at her lips. "Or B, as my mother used to call me." Daniel nodded, feeling a small barrier between them dissolve. "B it is, then." As they approached the ranch, Daniel pointed out the barn, the chicken coop, the small vegetable garden he'd started but admitted to neglecting. "I'm better with cattle than carrots," he confessed with a self-deprecating smile. The house itself was modest, but well-built, a main room with an iron stove for cooking and heat, a small bedroom off to one side, and a recently added second bedroom that Daniel explained would be hers. "I built it when I sent for you," he said, suddenly awkward. "Thought you'd want your own space." Beatrice looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "That was thoughtful of you." Inside, the house was clean but sparse, furnished with practical pieces rather than decorative ones. A bookshelf with a surprising number of volumes caught Beatrice's eye. "You like to read," she observed, running her fingers along the spines. "Winter nights are long," Daniel replied. "And a man can only clean his gun or mend tacks so many times before going mad with boredom." That earned him a genuine smile, small but real, and Daniel felt an unexpected warmth in his chest at the sight. He showed her to her room, where a new bed frame held a fresh straw mattress covered with clean linens. "It's not much," he admitted, "but I hope you'll be comfortable." "It's more than adequate," Beatrice assured him, setting her carpetbag on the bed. "Thank you." Daniel hesitated at the door. "I'll let you get settled. There's water in the kitchen basin if you want to wash up. I need to tend to the animals, but I'll be back to start supper." "I can cook," Beatrice offered quickly. "It's the least I can do." "We can figure out arrangements later," Daniel said. "Rest for now. You've had a long journey." Alone in the small room, Beatrice sat on the edge of the bed, her trembling fingers tracing the bruise on her face. The tears she'd held back for days finally spilled over, silent and hot against her cheeks. She hadn't expected kindness from the stranger she'd agreed to marry. She'd expected pragmatism at best, cruelty at worst. Daniel Calloway's restrained anger on her behalf, and his patient understanding had caught her completely off guard. She unpacked her meager belongings, placing her mother's silver hairbrush on the small table by the bed, hanging her 3 dresses in the wardrobe, and tucking her small collection of books beside the bed. The last item from her bag was a worn photograph of her parents, both long gone now. She propped it carefully on the windowsill where the afternoon light caught it. From outside came the sound of Daniel's voice, low and gentle as he spoke to his horses. Beatrice moved to the window and watched as he led them to the barn, his movements efficient and sure. He was a handsome man in a rugged way, taller than she had anticipated from his letters, with broad shoulders and dark hair that curled at the nape of his neck. His eyes were what had struck her most: deep blue and direct, but kind. Not at all like Gregory's eyes, which had been charming until they weren't, flashing with rage the night before she'd fled Boston. Beatrice shuddered at the memory and turned from the window, determined to focus on her present circumstances rather than the past that had driven her west. She had made her choice, desperate as it was, and now she would have to make the best of it. By the time Daniel returned to the house, Beatrice had washed her face, changed into a clean dress, and was examining the contents of his modest pantry. "I hope you don't mind," she said, turning as he entered. "I thought I might make myself useful." Daniel hung his hat on a peg by the door. "Not at all, though I should warn you I haven't had time to get to town this week. Supplies are running a bit low." "You have flour, lard, and salt," Beatrice observed. "That's enough for biscuits. And I saw you have chickens, perhaps eggs." Daniel nodded, something like admiration crossing his features. "I'll fetch some fresh ones." They worked together to prepare a simple meal, Daniel showing her how to operate the iron stove properly, Beatrice mixing biscuit dough with practiced hands. The domesticity of it felt strange to both of them, strangers playing at being a household, but not unpleasant. Over supper, Daniel kept the conversation light, telling her about the ranch, his small herd of cattle, his hopes to expand if the summer rains came as expected. He asked about her journey west, but carefully avoided anything that might lead to the subject of her injury. Beatrice was grateful for his tact, as she washed the dishes, refusing his offer to help with a firm "You cooked yesterday. I'll cook today." "That's fair." Beatrice found herself relaxing slightly for the first time in weeks. The fear that had been her constant companion since leaving Boston began to recede, just a fraction. "I've been thinking," Daniel said as he dried the last plate with a worn dish towel, "about taking you into town on Saturday. You'll need supplies of your own, and you should meet some of the townsfolk. Mrs. Patterson at the general store has a sewing circle. Thought you might be interested, being a seamstress and all." Beatrice's hands stilled in the wash basin. I'm not sure that's wise. Not yet." She gestured vaguely toward her eye, which was beginning to yellow at the edges but remained obviously bruised. Daniel set down the plate carefully. "I understand if you'd rather wait, but sooner or later you'll need to face them. Small towns talk, but they can also be kind once they know you." "And what will you tell them?" Beatrice asked quietly. "About me, about this." She touched her bruise lightly. "Nothing," Daniel said firmly. "Your story is yours to tell or keep. I won't speak of it to anyone." Beatrice studied him for a long moment, searching for deception and finding none. "Thank you," she finally said. "Perhaps in another week when this has faded more." "Whenever you're ready," Daniel agreed. "No rush." That night, in her new room with its unfamiliar sounds and smells, Beatrice lay awake listening to the distant lowing of cattle and the closer sounds of Daniel moving about in the main room, before retiring to his own bedroom. The walls between them seemed both too thin and impossibly thick, a stranger just steps away, who somehow held her entire future in his hands. She wondered what he truly thought of her, this mail-order bride who had arrived damaged goods. His kindness could be genuine, or it could be a mask that would slip away once they were married. Gregory had been kind too at first. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of Boston and the hands that had struck her face. Each time she woke gasping. The unfamiliar ceiling above reminded her how far she had come, and how much she had risked on the promise of a new life with a man she knew only through carefully worded letters. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through the calico curtains and the smell of coffee brewing. Beatrice dressed quickly in her second-best dress, a serviceable blue cotton, and pinned her hair in a simple style. The bruise was impossible to hide entirely, but she arranged a few curls to fall strategically near her temple. Daniel was already up, tending to the stove where a pot of something bubbled. He looked up when she entered, offering a nod that served as both greeting and approval of her appearance. "Hope you like porridge," he said, gesturing to the pot. "It's not fancy, but it's filling." "Porridge is fine," Beatrice assured him, moving to help set the table. "I'm not accustomed to elaborate breakfasts." They ate in companionable silence, the awkwardness of the previous day slightly diminished. Daniel explained his plans for the day, checking on a section of fence in the north pasture, moving some cattle to fresher grazing land, possibly shoeing his mare if time permitted. "Is there anything you need from me today?" Beatrice asked, gathering their empty bowls. Daniel seemed surprised by the question. "Need? No, nothing specific. The house is yours to arrange as you see fit. If you're inclined to cooking dinner, that would be welcome, but don't feel obligated." "I'd like to be useful," Beatrice insisted. "I didn't come here to be idle." Something in her tone made Daniel study her more carefully. "No one's questioning your worth, B. Take today to settle in. Tomorrow will be soon enough to establish routines." His perception unsettled her, but Beatrice nodded her agreement. As Daniel prepared to leave, he hesitated at the door. "I keep a revolver in the drawer by my bed," he said, his tone matter of fact. "Do you know how to use one?" Beatrice's eyes widened slightly. "No, I never had occasion to learn." "I'll teach you sometime soon," Daniel decided. "Out here, it's a necessary skill, not just for protection from two-legged threats but snakes and such." The thought of handling a firearm was both frightening and oddly empowering. "I'd appreciate that." Daniel nodded and settled his hat on his head. "I'll be back midday to check on you, then out again until evening." After he left, Beatrice explored the house more thoroughly, noting what was well-maintained and what needed attention. The windows could use washing, the floor a good scrubbing. The kitchen was organized in a bachelor's idea of order, which meant it wasn't organized at all. She set to work, grateful for the physical tasks that kept her mind occupied. By midday, when Daniel returned briefly to check on her, the main room was transformed, windows gleaming, floor scrubbed, shelves reorganized. The scent of soap and lavender, from the small sachet she'd brought from Boston, had replaced the masculine smell of leather and wood smoke. Daniel paused in the doorway, taking in the changes. "You've been busy." "I hope you don't mind," Beatrice said, suddenly uncertain. "I thought it could use a woman's touch." A slow smile spread across Daniel's face. "It's your home too, B, or it will be if you decide to stay. You can arrange it however you like. If you decide to stay." The words echoed in Beatrice's mind after he'd left again. He continued to leave the door open for her to change her mind to back out of their arrangement. It was a courtesy she hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to respond to. The afternoon stretched before her, and after completing her self-assigned household tasks, Beatrice ventured outside. The summer heat was intense but dry, nothing like the humid oppression of Boston summers. She explored the immediate surroundings of the house, the chicken coop, where she gathered more eggs, the small vegetable garden that indeed needed attention, the well with its cool, sweet water. From a distance, she could see Daniel on horseback, a dark figure against the golden landscape, moving among the scattered cattle. He sat his horse with ease, his movements synchronized with the animal beneath him. It was a far cry from the city men she had known, with their polished boots and spotless coats. For dinner, Beatrice prepared a simple stew with dried beef, and the few vegetables salvaged from the garden, along with biscuits that filled the house with their homey scent. When Daniel returned, dusty and tired but satisfied with his day's work, his appreciation for the meal was evident in his expression even before he voiced his thanks. "This is the best meal I've had in months," he said, helping himself to a second serving. "You're a better cook than you let on in your letters." Beatrice felt a flush of pleasure at the compliment. My mother taught me. She believed a woman should know how to make a comfortable home regardless of circumstances. Wise woman, Daniel commented. Is she still in Boston? The question dimmed Beatrice's smile. No. Both my parents died in the influenza outbreak of '69. That's partly why I. She trailed off, unwilling to delve into the chain of events that had led her to Gregory and ultimately to her decision to become a mail-order bride. Daniel seemed to understand her reluctance. I lost my parents young too. Father in the war, mother not long after from consumption. It's not easy making your way alone. The shared experience created a moment of connection between them that felt more substantial than the polite conversation they'd maintained thus far. No, it isn't easy, Beatrice agreed softly, but we do what we must. The evening passed quietly, with Daniel repairing a bridle at the table while Beatrice mended a shirt she'd found with a torn sleeve. The domesticity of the scene struck her as surreal, sitting in a ranch house in Missouri with a man she barely knew, acting for all the world like an established household. You never asked about my eye again, Beatrice said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Daniel's hand stilled on the leather. Figured you'd tell me when you were ready. Or not. Some stories aren't meant to be shared. Don't you want to know what kind of woman you've brought into your home? Beatrice pressed, needing to understand his unusual restraint. Daniel set the bridle aside and met her gaze directly. I know what kind of woman you are. You're brave enough to travel across the country to marry a stranger. You're hardworking and take pride in it. You're educated but not prideful about it. He paused, his expression softening. And you're carrying a hurt that goes deeper than that bruise. The rest are just details. Tears pricked at Beatrice's eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She blinked them back. You're very perceptive, Daniel Calloway. Not particularly, he disagreed with a half-smile. Just lived long enough to recognize that most folks are fighting battles others know nothing about. They retired soon after, each to their separate rooms with a tentative good night that seemed insufficient for the fragile understanding growing between them. As the days passed, they fell into a rhythm together. Beatrice took over the cooking and household management, while Daniel taught her about the ranch, how to gather eggs without upsetting the hens, how to tell when a storm was brewing by the behavior of the cattle, which wild plants were edible and which to avoid. On the fourth day, when Beatrice was hanging laundry on the line stretched between two posts near the house, she spotted a cloud of dust in the distance that resolved into a rider approaching the ranch. Her hands froze on the damp shirt she'd been pinning up, fear instinctively tightening her throat. Daniel emerged from the barn, apparently having seen the rider as well, and moved to stand between the approaching figure and Beatrice. His posture was casual but alert, one hand resting near his hip where she knew he carried a revolver. "It's all right," he called to her. "That's just Hank Miller, neighboring rancher, probably coming to borrow my post-hole digger again." The reassurance eased her tension somewhat, but Beatrice still retreated to the porch, unwilling to face a stranger with her bruise still visible, though fading to a yellowish green. The rider, a weather-beaten man in his 50s with a gray-streaked beard, pulled up his horse and dismounted with a nod to Daniel. His curious gaze drifted to Beatrice on the porch. "So the rumors are true," he said to Daniel. "You finally got yourself a bride." Daniel's expression remained neutral. "Hank, this is Miss Beatrice Donovan. Beatrice, this is Henry Miller." His spread borders mine to the east. Beatrice inclined her head in greeting but didn't approach. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Miller." Hank touched his hat brim. "Madam. Welcome to Missouri." If he noticed her bruise, he had the courtesy not to mention it, The men discussed some business about a shared water source and the upcoming cattle drive to the railroad at Sedalia. Beatrice returned to hanging laundry, though she kept her ears tuned to their conversation. "Town's buzzing about you," she overheard Hank saying in a lower voice. "Martha Jenkins is particularly put out, thought her Abigail had a claim on you." Daniel's response was too quiet to hear, but whatever he said made Hank laugh and clap him on the shoulder. After Hank departed, Daniel approached Beatrice at the laundry line. "Sorry about that. News travels fast out here." "It's fine," Beatrice assured him, though the mention of town gossip made her uneasy. Was he right? About someone named Abigail? Daniel looked surprised at the question. "Martha's had notions about matching me with her daughter for years, but there was never anything to it. Abigail's a nice enough girl, but—" He shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. "But," Beatrice prompted, surprising herself with her curiosity. Daniel's expression turned thoughtful. "She's looking for someone to take her to St. Louis or even back east. I'm not that man. Never will be." The answer satisfied something in Beatrice she hadn't realized needed satisfying. "I see." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Beatrice finally found the courage to tell her story. "His name was Gregory Ashford," she began without preamble. "After my parents died, I took work as a seamstress at a fine lady's shop in Boston. Gregory was the owner's son. He took an interest in me, said I had refined manners unusual for someone in my position." Daniel listened silently, his expression neutral but attentive. "He courted me properly at first. Walks in the common, tea at respectable establishments. He spoke of marriage, of saving me from a life of drudgery." Beatrice's hands twisted in her lap. "I believed him. I wanted to believe him. When he suggested I leave the shop and move into a small apartment he would provide, I agreed. My reputation suffered, but I thought it temporary until we could marry." The bitterness in her voice was impossible to hide. There was always some reason to delay the wedding. His mother's health, business concerns, the proper season. Meanwhile, he grew possessive, controlling. Angry when I spoke to other men, even shopkeepers. He began to drink more heavily. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting her continue at her own pace. "The first time he struck me, he wept afterward, swore it would never happen again, blamed the whiskey." Beatrice's fingernails dug into her palms. "I believed that too, until it happened again, and again. The night before I left, he was in a rage over a client who had spoken kindly to me. He accused me of impropriety. When I defended myself, Her hand drifted unconsciously to her eye. "I realized then that he would never marry me, that I was trapped in a situation of my own making with a man who would eventually kill me in one of his rages." Daniel's voice was rough when he finally spoke. "So you ran?" Beatrice nodded. "I had been secretly saving what little money I could, not enough for a proper start somewhere new, but enough for train fare west. I'd seen advertisements for mail-order brides in the newspaper. Your letter was kind. Honest. You didn't promise luxury or romance, just respect and partnership. So you took a chance on a stranger," Daniel concluded. "Better a stranger with honest intentions than a familiar face with lies," Beatrice said softly. "I left that night while he slept off his whiskey. Took only what I could carry and didn't look back." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, digesting her story. When he finally spoke, his words surprised her. "Thank you for trusting me with the truth." No condemnation, no pity, just simple acknowledgement of her confidence. Beatrice felt something tight within her chest loosen slightly. "I wanted you to know," she said, "before you decide whether to go through with the marriage." Daniel turned to face her more directly, his expression serious in the fading light. "Beatrice, I meant what I said before. Nothing in your past changes my willingness to honor our arrangement, but I won't hold you to it either. If you decide this isn't what you want, I'll help you get established elsewhere." The generosity of the offer brought fresh tears to Beatrice's eyes. "Why would you do that?" "You paid for my passage. You built a room for me." "Because a marriage should be entered freely, not out of desperation," Daniel said simply. "I want a wife, not a prisoner." The stark contrast between his words and Gregory's actions made Beatrice's breath catch. "You're a good man, Daniel Calloway." He shook his head slightly. "Just trying to be fair. Take the time you need to decide." That night, lying in her bed with moonlight streaming through the window, Beatrice considered her options with clearer eyes than she had in months. She could stay and marry Daniel, a man who had shown her nothing but decency and respect. She could ask for his help in establishing herself elsewhere, perhaps in Clifton Hill or one of the larger towns nearby. Or she could take what money she had left and continue west to California or Oregon, where women were scarce and opportunities more abundant. The decision wasn't as simple as it had first appeared. Marriage to Daniel offered security and the chance for a real home, something she'd longed for since her parents' deaths. But was security enough? Could respect grow into something more with time? And what did Daniel truly want from a wife beyond the practical benefits of having a woman tend his home? These questions followed her into the next day as she went about her tasks, feeding chickens, weeding the neglected garden, preparing meals. Daniel was busy with ranch work, leaving her alone with her thoughts for most of the day. When Saturday arrived, Daniel approached her after breakfast. "I'm heading into town for supplies. Would you like to come along? Your eyes looking much better." The bruise had indeed faded to a pale yellow that could almost be concealed with careful arrangement of her hair. Still, Beatrice hesitated. "Are you sure it's wise? I don't want to cause gossip that might reflect poorly on you." Daniel's expression softened. "Gossip happens regardless. Better to face it head-on than hide away. Besides," he added with a small smile, "I'd value your opinion on some fabric for new curtains. Mine are pretty sorry affairs, as you've noticed." The invitation to participate in improving their home, his acknowledgement that it could be their home, tipped the scale for Beatrice. "I'll get my hat." The ride to Clifton Hill was pleasant, the summer morning not yet too hot, a breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers across the prairie. Daniel pointed out landmarks and neighboring ranches, told her stories about local characters she would soon meet, and generally did his best to prepare her for her first proper introduction to the community. The general store is run by the Patterson family, Harvey and Martha. They're good people if a bit nosy. The mercantile belongs to Edwin Graves, who charges more but carries finer goods from back east. The saloon. Daniel hesitated. "Well, you probably won't have occasion to visit there, but it's owned by a fellow named Burke, decent enough as saloon keepers go." Clifton Hill was smaller than Beatrice had anticipated, a single main street with wooden buildings on either side, most with false fronts trying to appear more substantial than they were. A white clapboard church stood at one end of the street, a combined jailhouse and sheriff's office at the other. Between them lay the businesses that served the town and surrounding ranches: general store, mercantile, saloon, blacksmith, small hotel, and a few others. As their wagon rolled down the main street, Beatrice felt eyes turning toward them, conversations pausing mid-sentence. She sat straighter, chin lifted slightly, determined not to show the anxiety churning inside her. Daniel parked the wagon in front of the general store, then came around to help her down. His hand on her elbow was steady, reassuring. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Beatrice nodded, grateful for his support. "As I'll ever be." Inside, the store was a treasure trove of goods: barrels of flour and sugar, Shelves of canned foods, tools hanging from the rafters, fabric bolts stacked on a long counter, and glass cases containing everything from patent medicines to hair combs. The smell of coffee, leather, and spices filled the air. Behind the counter stood a plump woman with graying hair and shrewd eyes that lit up with interest as Daniel and Beatrice entered. Daniel Calloway, as I live and breathe, and this must be your bride we've all been hearing about. She came around the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. Martha Patterson, dear, welcome to Clifton Hill. Beatrice offered her hand. Beatrice Donovan, thank you for the welcome, Mrs. Patterson. Martha's eyes darted briefly to the fading bruise before returning to Beatrice's face. My, aren't you a pretty one even with that nasty injury? Stagecoach accident, was it? Those drivers take the roads much too fast these days. The ready-made excuse was a kindness Beatrice hadn't expected. Yes, she agreed, seizing the opportunity. A sudden stop threw me against the door handle. Most unfortunate timing. Martha nodded sympathetically. Well, you're here safe now, and that's what matters. Daniel's a good catch, owns his land free and clear, no drinking or gambling to speak of, and handy with just about anything that needs fixing. She patted Daniel's arm as if he were a prized stallion being shown at auction. Daniel cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. We need supplies, Martha, and Miss Donovan would like to look at your fabric selection for curtains. Of course, of course. Harvey's in the back. He'll help with the heavy goods. You just come with me, dear, and we'll find something to brighten up that bachelor house of his. Martha led Beatrice to the fabric counter, leaving Daniel to seek out her husband. Over the next hour, Beatrice selected fabric for curtains and tablecloths, thread for mending, a new brush for her hair, and various kitchen supplies that Daniel's house lacked. Martha introduced her to several women who came into the store, including the minister's wife, Mrs. Abernathy, who invited them both to Sunday services. The congregation will be so pleased to meet you, Mrs. Abernathy said warmly. We've all been praying for Daniel to find a suitable companion. Beatrice couldn't help noticing the speculative glances at her fading bruise, the careful phrasing of questions about her background. She kept her answers truthful but vague. Yes, she was from Boston. No, she had no family there anymore. Yes, she had worked as a seamstress. The journey west had been long but educational. When Daniel finally collected her, the wagon loaded with supplies, Beatrice felt exhausted from the social interactions, but also relieved. The townsfolk had been curious but not unkind, and the story of a stagecoach accident seemed to have been accepted without question. Their last stop was the mercantile, where Daniel insisted on purchasing fabric for a new dress for Beatrice. For the wedding, he explained when she protested the expense. If you decide to go through with it, that is. The conditional phrase didn't escape the shopkeeper's notice, but he was tactful enough not to comment, focusing instead on showing Beatrice his selection of finer fabrics. As they rode back to the ranch, Beatrice reflected on the morning's experiences. They were kinder than I expected. Daniel nodded. Told you they would be. Small towns can be quick to judge, but they're also quick to accept once they've made up their minds about you, and they seem to have decided you'll do just fine. Even with my mysterious injury, Beatrice asked with a hint of wry humor. Especially with that, Daniel said seriously. Martha Patterson's no fool. She recognized a woman who's had trouble and decided to give you the benefit of the doubt. That means something in a place like Clifton Hill. The knowledge that at least some of the townspeople understood more than they let on was both unsettling and oddly comforting. Beatrice had expected judgment, not compassion. The following day was Sunday, and after some deliberation, Beatrice agreed to accompany Daniel to church services. She wore her best dress, a navy blue wool that was too warm for the season but more formal than her other options, and arranged her hair to minimize the visibility of her now faint bruise. The little white church was filled nearly to capacity when they arrived, and a subtle hush fell over the congregation as Daniel escorted Beatrice to a pew midway down the aisle. She felt the weight of curious stares but kept her gaze forward, her spine straight. The service itself was familiar and comforting, not so different from what she had known in Boston. The minister, Reverend Abernathy, gave a sermon on compassion and new beginnings that seemed almost pointed in its relevance to her situation. When it came time for hymns, Daniel surprised her by having a pleasant baritone voice that blended well with her own soprano. Afterward, on the church steps, they were surrounded by well-wishers and curious neighbors. Daniel kept a protective presence at her side, smoothly deflecting overly personal questions and introducing her to so many people that the names became a blur. One introduction, however, stood out. A tall, elegantly dressed woman with a daughter of similar height and coloring approached them with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Daniel, how lovely to see you in church again," the woman said, her tone suggesting it was a rare occurrence. "And this must be your mail-order bride we've all heard so much about." The slight emphasis on mail order was impossible to miss. "Martha Jenkins," Daniel said, his voice carefully neutral, "and her daughter Abigail. This is Beatrice Donovan." So this was the Abigail who had allegedly had designs on Daniel. Beatrice studied the young woman with interest, pretty in a conventional way, with fair hair and blue eyes, dressed in a fashion that would have been appropriate in Boston 2 seasons ago. "Charmed," Martha Jenkins said without sounding charmed at all. "Such a brave thing to travel all that way to marry a man you've never met, especially with the accident you suffered en route." There was something in her tone that made Beatrice wonder if Mrs. Jenkins believed the stagecoach story at all. "Sometimes the greatest rewards require the greatest risks," Beatrice replied evenly. "I've found Missouri to be most welcoming thus far." Daniel's hand came to rest lightly at the small of her back, not possessive, but supportive. The gesture wasn't lost on Martha Jenkins, whose smile tightened further. "Yes, we're known for our hospitality. When is the happy day to be, Daniel? I understand Reverend Abernathy will be making his circuit again in a few weeks." "We haven't set a date yet," Daniel replied. "Giving ourselves time to be sure." Abigail, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "That's very sensible of you both. Marriage is such an important decision." Her tone was kinder than her mother's, almost sympathetic. "Indeed it is," Beatrice agreed. "Fortunately, Mr. Calloway has been nothing but considerate in that regard." Martha Jenkins looked as though she had more to say, but at that moment they were interrupted by the blacksmith's wife with questions about a quilting circle, allowing Daniel and Beatrice to politely excuse themselves. As they drove home, Daniel apologized for the encounter. "Martha Jenkins has been trying to match me with Abigail since the girl turned 16. Can't seem to accept that her plans don't align with mine or Abigail's for that matter." "Abigail seemed nice enough," Beatrice observed. "Not as interested in me as a rival as her mother was." Daniel chuckled. "Abigail's sweet on the new schoolteacher who arrived last spring. She's just waiting for her mother to realize it's a lost cause all around." The easy way he spoke of local relationships made Beatrice feel more included in his world, less like an outsider looking in. It was a pleasant feeling, this gradual sense of belonging. The next few days fell into a comfortable routine. Daniel taught Beatrice more about the ranch operations, how to milk the cow they kept for household use, how to judge when vegetables were ready for harvesting, even how to handle the gentle mare he kept for occasional riding. As promised, he also taught her to shoot his revolver. They stood behind the barn, Daniel positioning himself behind her to show the proper stance, his arms encircling her to demonstrate how to hold the weapon. "Keep both eyes open," he instructed, his breath warm against her ear. "Sight down the barrel and squeeze the trigger gently, don't pull it." Beatrice was acutely aware of his proximity, the solid warmth of his chest against her back, the careful way his hands positioned hers on the revolver. When she fired and the can they'd set up as a target flew off the fence post, she couldn't help a delighted laugh. "I did it," she exclaimed, turning toward him with excitement. For a moment they were standing very close, her face tilted up to his eyes reflecting her smile. Something shifted in the air between them, a tension that hadn't been there before. Daniel stepped back first, clearing his throat. "Good shot. Let's try again." By the end of the lesson, Beatrice could consistently hit the target, and Daniel pronounced her capable of defending herself if necessary. "Practice makes perfect," he added. "We'll do this again soon." The moment of connection wasn't discussed, but Beatrice found herself thinking about it in quiet moments, the way his eyes had softened when she smiled, the gentle strength in his hands as they guided hers. A week after her arrival, as they sat on the porch after dinner watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky, Daniel broached the subject they'd been dancing around. "The preacher will be back in town next Sunday," he said, his gaze on the horizon. "If you've made your decision." Beatrice had indeed been considering her options carefully. In the short time she'd been at the ranch, she'd seen nothing to make her doubt Daniel's character. He was hardworking, honest, and treated her with unfailing respect. He made no demands on her time or affections, seemed genuinely interested in her opinions, and had shown patience beyond what most men would offer. More than that, she'd begun to feel something when he was near, a warmth that had nothing to do with practical considerations and everything to do with the man himself. The way he spoke to his animals with the same consideration he showed to people. His quiet humor that emerged in unexpected moments. The gentleness of his hands when he helped her down from the wagon or showed her how to hold the reins. "I have," she said softly. "If you're still willing, I'd like to honor our arrangement." Daniel turned to face her, his expression serious. "I need to be sure you're choosing this freely, B. Not out of obligation or lack of options." Beatrice met his gaze steadily. "I'm choosing it because I believe we could build something good together, something based on mutual respect and perhaps, in time, deeper feelings." The admission cost her some courage, but it felt important to be honest about her hopes. A slow smile spread across Daniel's face, transforming his features. "That's what I want too," he said simply. "A chance to build something real." He reached across the space between them and took her hand in his, a gesture that felt both momentous and natural. They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell, their joined hands a promise more binding than words. The days leading up to Sunday were filled with preparations. Beatrice worked on her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of pale blue cotton with white lace trim that she'd purchased at the mercantile. Daniel made repairs around the house that he'd been putting off, and even built a proper garden fence to keep out rabbits. They rode into town on Saturday to file the necessary paperwork with the county clerk and to invite a few neighbors to witness the ceremony. Martha Patterson insisted on hosting a small reception afterward at her home. "Nothing elaborate," she assured them. "Just cake and punch and a chance for folks to wish you well proper-like." That evening, their last before becoming husband and wife, Daniel surprised Beatrice with a small wooden box. "It was my mother's," he explained as she opened it to reveal a simple gold band. "Not fancy, but it would honor me if you'd wear it." Beatrice traced the smooth circle with her fingertip, touched beyond words by the sentiment behind the gift. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Thank you for wanting me to have something so precious to you." Daniel's expression was soft in the lamplight. "You should have pretty things, Bea. Wish I could give you more of them." "Things aren't what make a home," she told him with certainty born of hard experience. "People do. The care they show each other, that's what matters." His hand covered hers, warm and steady. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "tomorrow you'll be my wife." The word sent a shiver through her that was equal parts anticipation and nervousness. Wife. After tomorrow, they would share not just a home but a life, a bed, a future. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. That night, in her room for the last time, Beatrice looked at her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin. The bruise was gone now, leaving no visible trace of Gregory's violence. But the memory remained, a shadow that sometimes still made her flinch when a door closed too loudly or a hand moved too quickly. "I choose this," she told her reflection firmly. "I choose to trust again, to hope again." The morning dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself approved of the day's events. Beatrice dressed carefully in her new blue gown, arranged her hair in a style more elaborate than her usual simple knot, and pinned a sprig of wildflowers Daniel had brought her to her bodice. When she emerged from her room, Daniel was waiting in the main room, dressed in his best dark suit, his hair slicked back and his beard neatly trimmed. The look of appreciation in his eyes as he saw her made Beatrice blush. "You're beautiful," he said simply. "And you're very handsome," she returned, meaning it. In his formal clothes, with his tall frame and broad shoulders, Daniel cut an impressive figure far from the rough cowboy she had initially expected. The church was filled with more people than Beatrice had anticipated, not just the few neighbors they'd invited, but what seemed like half the town. News traveled fast in Clifton Hill, and a wedding was an event no one wanted to miss. Reverend Abernathy met them at the door with a warm smile. "Are you ready, my children?" Daniel looked to Beatrice, giving her one last chance to change her mind. She nodded, her decision firm. "We're ready." The ceremony was brief but meaningful, the traditional vows resonating in the small church as Beatrice and Daniel promised to love, honor, and cherish each other until death parted them. When Daniel slipped his mother's ring onto her finger, Beatrice felt a sense of rightness, of coming home after a long journey. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Abernathy announced, and Daniel leaned down to press his lips gently against hers, their first kiss, witnessed by the entire community. It was brief and chaste, but Beatrice felt it down to her toes, a promise of tenderness to come. The reception at the Patterson home was a lively affair, with music from a fiddle and banjo, platters of food contributed by neighboring farms, and a beautiful cake made by Martha herself. Beatrice found herself surrounded by well-wishers, many of whom pressed small gifts into her hands: embroidered handkerchiefs, jars of preserves, hand-sewn kitchen towels. "Welcome to Clifton Hill, Mrs. Calloway," they said, and each time Beatrice heard her new name, it became more real, more hers. Even Martha Jenkins offered congratulations, though her smile remained strained. Abigail, however, seemed genuinely happy for them, especially when the young schoolteacher hovered attentively at her side throughout the reception. By late afternoon, Daniel could see that Beatrice was tiring from the constant socializing, and he smoothly made their excuses. "My wife and I should head back before dark," he said, the pride in his voice when he said "my wife" unmistakable. The ride home was quiet, both of them processing the day's events and what lay ahead. When they arrived at the ranch, their home now, truly shared, Daniel helped Beatrice down from the wagon and then, to her surprise, swept her into his arms. Tradition, he explained with a smile as he carried her across the threshold. For luck and happiness. Inside, he set her gently on her feet but didn't immediately step away. Instead, his hands came up to frame her face, his expression serious. "I meant every word of those vows, Bea," he said softly. "I'll do my best to be a good husband to you, patient and kind like the good book says." Beatrice leaned into his touch, her heart full. "And I'll be a good wife to you, Daniel, faithful and true." This time when he kissed her, there was no audience, no restraint required. His lips were warm and gentle against hers, asking rather than demanding, giving her time to respond on her own terms. Beatrice found herself leaning closer, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they separated, Daniel's eyes were dark with emotion. "I know this isn't a love match, at least not yet," he said carefully. "And I won't rush you. We have time to let feelings grow." The consideration behind his words touched Beatrice deeply. Gregory had never considered her feelings, only his desires. Daniel's willingness to wait, to build something genuine between them, was a gift she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she whispered. "For understanding, for being patient." He smiled and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Now, Mrs. Calloway, shall we see about some supper? I'm famished after all that socializing." The evening passed in comfortable domesticity as they prepared a simple meal together, moving around the kitchen with growing familiarity. When it came time for bed, however, the awkwardness returned. They stood in the main room, both aware of the change in their relationship status but uncertain how to proceed. Daniel broke the tension with characteristic directness. "I meant what I said about not rushing you, Bea. If you'd prefer to keep your own room for now, I'll understand." Beatrice considered his offer, grateful for the choice but also aware of her own growing feelings for this man who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. "I think," she said carefully, "that I'd like to try being a proper wife to you, if you'll be patient with my inexperience." The relief and desire that crossed Daniel's face was unmistakable, but he kept his tone gentle. "I'll be honored to share my bed with you, Bea, and we'll take things as slow as you need." That night, in the soft darkness of their bedroom, he was true to his word. Patient and gentle, attentive to her responses, he introduced Beatrice to physical intimacy as a thing of beauty and mutual pleasure rather than the duty she had feared. When they finally lay together, skin to skin, breath mingling, Beatrice felt a sense of wonder at the connection between them, not just physical but emotional, a bridge being built between two souls who had both known loneliness. "All right," Daniel murmured against her hair as she lay curled against his side afterward. "More than all right," Beatrice assured him, marveling at how safe she felt in his arms. "Perfect." As summer turned to fall, their relationship deepened in ways both expected and surprising. They worked side by side during the day, Beatrice taking charge of the house and garden, learning to make soap and candles from Martha Patterson, while Daniel tended the cattle and prepared the ranch for winter. At night, they discovered each other's bodies with growing confidence and affection, the initial awkwardness giving way to a passionate understanding that left them both breathless and smiling in the darkness. But it wasn't just physical intimacy that bound them. They really talked about their hopes and fears, their pasts and futures. Daniel told her about his dreams for the ranch, how he hoped to expand their herd and maybe build a larger house someday. Beatrice shared stories of her childhood in Boston, the lessons her mother had taught her, the books she loved. They had their disagreements too, Beatrice's city-bred ideas sometimes clashing with Daniel's practical ranch experience. But they learned to listen to each other, to find compromises that incorporated both perspectives. By the time the first snow dusted the prairie in early December, Beatrice knew with certainty that what had begun as a practical arrangement had blossomed into genuine love. She loved Daniel's quiet strength, his unwavering integrity, the tenderness he showed not just to her, but to all living things in his care. She loved his rare but wonderful laugh, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the feel of his calloused hands against her skin. More importantly, she felt loved in return not as a possession or an ornament, but as a partner, valued for her mind as much as her domestic skills or physical attributes. The evidence of Daniel's love was in 100 small gestures, the way he always brought her wildflowers when he found them on his rides, how he'd built shelves for her growing collection of books, the gentle way he held her at night. It was in his pride when he introduced her to neighboring ranchers, his interest in her opinions on ranch decisions, his patience as she learned the skills required of a frontier wife. Winter on the prairie was harsh, with blizzards that sometimes kept them housebound for days. But those days of enforced closeness in their snug home only strengthened their bond. They read aloud to each other by lamplight, played cards, made love in the afternoon when the light through frost-covered windows turned everything golden. Daniel taught Beatrice to play chess on a set he'd carved himself years ago, and she proved a quick study, soon giving him real competition. Spring arrived with an explosion of wildflowers across the prairie and news that made their happiness complete. Beatrice was expecting a child in the late fall. Daniel's reaction to her announcement was everything she could have hoped for: joy, wonder, and immediate concern for her well-being. "Are you feeling all right? Do you need to see Doc Miller? I'll ride into town today if you." Beatrice laughed and silenced him with a kiss. "I'm perfectly fine, Daniel. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. But yes, we should visit the doctor soon." In the months that followed, Daniel's protectiveness reached new heights. He insisted on taking over the more strenuous household chores, hired a local boy to help with the garden, and even built a cradle from wood he'd been saving for something special. Beatrice accepted his care with good grace, though she drew the line when he suggested she might not want to accompany him to the harvest festival in town. "I'm having a baby, Daniel, not turning into porcelain," she told him firmly. "I need the company of other women, and fresh air is good for both me and the child." The festival was a joyous occasion, with Beatrice's condition drawing congratulations from all sides. Even Martha Jenkins seemed genuinely pleased for them, especially now that her daughter Abigail was officially engaged to the schoolteacher. As Beatrice's time grew closer, Daniel arranged for Martha Patterson to stay with them for the delivery. "She's helped bring half the babies in the county into the world," he explained. "And I'd feel better having someone experienced here, just in case." Their son was born on a crisp November day, after a labor that was difficult but not dangerously so. Daniel paced outside the bedroom door, driven nearly mad by Beatrice's cries, until Martha finally called him in to meet his son, a healthy, red-faced boy with a shock of dark hair like his father's. "He's perfect," Daniel whispered, tears in his eyes as he held his son for the first time. Just like his mother. Beatrice, exhausted but radiant, smiled up at the tableau they made her husband cradling their child with such tender awe. "What shall we name him?" They had discussed names but never settled on one. Now, looking down at the tiny face that somehow combined features from both of them, Daniel said, "James, after your father." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to Beatrice's eyes. "James Daniel Calloway," she agreed. "A good, strong name for a good, strong boy." As winter settled over the prairie once more, the Calloway household adjusted to its newest member. James proved to be a good-natured baby, with his father's steady temperament and his mother's curious eyes. Daniel took to fatherhood with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, changing diapers without complaint and walking the floor with James during fussy nights so Beatrice could rest. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fireplace with James sleeping peacefully in his cradle beside them, Beatrice reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the desperate young woman with a bruised face stepping off a stagecoach to the confident wife and mother she had become, the transformation seemed almost miraculous. "Penny for your thoughts," Daniel said, noticing her contemplative expression. Beatrice smiled and took his hand. "I was just thinking about how differently things might have turned out if I hadn't found the courage to leave Boston, if you hadn't been so patient and kind when I arrived." Daniel squeezed her fingers gently. "Sometimes the worst moments in our lives lead us to the best ones. If that man hadn't hurt you, you might never have come west. We might never have met." "I can't regret the path that led me to you," Beatrice agreed. "Even the painful parts." Daniel leaned over to kiss her softly. "I thank God every day that you had the courage to make that journey that you chose to stay and build a life with me." "The best choice I ever made," she assured him, resting her head on his shoulder. Outside, snow fell gently on the prairie, blanketing their small corner of the world in peaceful white. Inside, the fire crackled, the baby sighed in his sleep, and two people who had once been strangers held each other close, bound by a love that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings. In the years that followed, the Calloway ranch prospered under their joint care. Daniel's cattle herd grew, allowing them to build the larger house he had dreamed of, a comfortable two-story home with plenty of room for their expanding family. James was joined by a sister, Emma, 2 years later, and eventually by another brother, William. Beatrice became a respected member of the Clifton Hill community, serving on the school board and teaching sewing classes to young girls. Her garden became famous throughout the county, providing vegetables and flowers in abundance. When a new church was built, she designed and sewed the altar cloth, a beautiful piece that incorporated symbols meaningful to the congregation. Daniel's reputation as a fair and successful rancher grew as well. He was elected to the town council, where his practical wisdom and integrity made him a valued voice in local governance. When the railroad finally came to Clifton Hill in 1882, he was instrumental in negotiating favorable terms for local businesses and ranchers. They never forgot where they had started, a desperate young woman fleeing abuse and a lonely rancher seeking partnership. Each year on their anniversary, they would sit on the porch of their home. Even after building the new house, they kept the original as a guest cottage and watched the sunset together, remembering that first meeting and marveling at the life they had built from such uncertain beginnings. When their children were old enough to understand, Beatrice and Daniel shared their story, not the details of Gregory's violence, but the broader narrative of courage, second chances, and love that grows from respect and kindness. It became a family legend of sorts, a reminder that happiness often comes from unexpected places and that the strongest foundations are built on mutual care and consideration. "Your mother," Daniel would tell their wide-eyed children, "is the bravest person I've ever known. She traveled across the entire country to marry a man she'd never met, just on the strength of a few letters and a whole lot of faith. And your father," Beatrice would add, smiling at her husband across the years, "is the kindest man in all of Missouri." He looked at a woman with a blackened eye and saw not damaged goods, but someone worth protecting, worth knowing, worth loving. "Worth everything," Daniel would always finish, reaching for her hand in a gesture that, even after decades of marriage, still held the same tenderness as it had on that porch so many years before. And Beatrice, her hand fitting perfectly into his as it always had, would think of the frightened young woman who had stepped off that stagecoach in Clifton Hill, and marvel at how far she had come not just in miles, but in happiness, in security, in love. The bruises had faded. The scars had healed. And in their place had grown something beautiful and lasting, proof that even the darkest beginnings can lead to the brightest of lives when two people choose to face the future together with courage, patience, and open hearts.